This is the last session of today, and it deliberately is structured to flow on, Kwong, from your reflections over the first 2 days of the conference. I stress first 2 days because, of course, there is day 3 yet to come. But the first 2 days of the conference, and I'm joined on the panel by some faces that you have seen before. Kwong, of course, you just heard speaking a moment ago. Next to Kwong is Sophie Johnston, the president of NUS. Delighted to have you back on the platform, Sophie. Thank you. In the middle of the panel is Emeritus Professor Cliff Walsh, who is one of the TEQSA commissioners, and will no doubt be ready to reflect on that very long list of things that TEQSA might or might not do in the future. And then on my immediate left, Sadie Heckenberg. Great to have you back again, Sadie, here, President of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Postgraduate Association. So emblematic of the conference as a whole, we've got a mixture of academic staff, commissioners, students, and that's terrific and very much as it should be. And what I wanted to do was just start, I think, by asking each of you, giving you the opportunity to take 2 or 3 minutes to just reflect on some, as Kwong has been doing, just to reflect on some of the main takeaways for you at the end of the second day of the conference. And I might, if I may, start with you, Sophie. Students are one of those 3 elements that were are very much part of the theme of the conference, and there has been a significant amount of student participation. So could I ask you from your perspective for your thoughts as we reach this stage of the conference?
Yeah, it's been a great couple of days. I think from the perspective of someone who's been a student leader over the past 3 years, gone to countless conferences, this is probably the first time that I can honestly say that it's very heartening to see how much engagement and involvement and focus is placed on the student perspective, not only the issues we face and the challenges for the sector over the next 10 to 15 years, actually wanting to understand what students think about that, what solutions that we have, going forward in addressing some of the issues that we talk about. Like I said yesterday, it is a really, really exciting time for higher education, but it's also a very challenging time. There's going to be a number of changes, really dramatic changes, I think, for the sector and the workforce in the next couple of decades. But the last couple of days, we've had some really, really in-depth and great discussions that it's very heartening for me to see going forward, and also seeing students really, really at the heart of that is, I think, a positive thing.
Thanks, Sophie. And I ought to just add on to that, because it was referred to, excuse me, in the previous discussion. Yesterday, one of the things that happened here was a lunch with the student representatives, and TEQSA announced at that lunch that we were forming a student expert advisory board. So there will be a student panel which is able to share its reflections and its views directly with our commissioners, which is a very good cue, Cliff, for coming to you and asking for your thoughts about TEQSA and some of the things that have been suggested for TEQSA's future.
There's been so much, it's kind of difficult to absorb it all, and I don't want to even try. I'd like to sort of deal with the student issue. We tried to make it a major part of the conference. I think it has been. I think the fact that we're setting up a group and actually calling it an expert group, you are experts on what it is we need to know, and you're also experts, and this seems to me to be a kind of important issue. You're experts on how we can consult with students. We need to consult you about how to consult. I mean, because it's a huge task. We recognise that, and we really want to draw it in. As you probably know, in England, the regulator that will be established early next year is actually called the Office for Students. You'll be amused, the CEO designate at a speech to the NUS conference said it is the Office for Students, not the Office for the National Union of Students, which I thought was a very interesting and kind of subtle point there. But what you see, my reason for raising the Office of Students is not just because it's called an Office of Students, but because its objectives has 4 of them. All 4 start with the same 5 words. All students from all backgrounds. Our focus is there. We will do this for all students of all backgrounds. We at TEQSA see students as being right there, but we probably have never articulated it enough, and I think that what's happening, including this conference, will help us to focus our minds better on what we need to do. But I think the biggest challenge actually was laid out by you yesterday, Sophie, when you said what we need to be doing is thinking about 10, 20, 30 years ahead, because sort of life and work life and career is going to be so much different. How do you consult with a future generation of students who have a completely different set of interests? I mean, we really need to be, I think, getting our heads around what representation, what consultation means in a context where sort of mature age students, people coming back into the system in order to upskill and so on, need to be engaged as part of the consultation process. I have to say, it's 46 years ago, roughly speaking, that I first got a lectureship at ANU. I think that the way that we now engage with students is so much better than it was then. It's remarkable, although I also accept what Peter Coldrake was saying this morning, which is that to a significant extent, the engagement, the participation of students, the influence of students over what we do has been of relatively recent origin. In effect, since I stopped sort of actively being on the academic scene. But I think it's up to you now to sort of grasp the opportunities that I think everybody is accepting that you have, and I'm really looking forward to, as a commissioner, being an observer into the contributions that you and others make to our thinking about engagement with students.
Cliff, thank you. I can't resist, just as you finished speaking there, I can't resist asking you the question that was raised by Kwong in his comments, without inviting you to make regulatory policy on the spot. But this idea that somehow we ought to recapture in some way the visiting, the seeing at first hand, what's going on home ground for the providers. Yeah. I mean, is that something that resonates with you?
Oh, absolutely. I actually made a note of it and I meant to mention it. It's something that we actually have been talking about quite a lot more recently. It includes, Mick was saying at the opening, part of our forward thinking is, well, can we reduce the burden even further by reducing the extent to which we rely on these cyclical assessments and use monitoring rather more. And in that context, I mean, one of the most important ways, if you like, of monitoring is actually to go out there and make visits to our providers and find out what's going on. But it's broader than that, and Kwong's point, I think, was this broader one. It's about engagement. It's not just about monitoring or assessment, it's about engagement. It's something that's really important that we've now pretty much woven into our processes for all new providers, that they will have a visit from us within 15 months and probably one every year for the first few years of their existence. We now want to introduce that more into our activities on an ongoing basis, so that a visit would be, in some sense, mid-cycle, you would expect to make a visit to every one of the providers. Maybe I'm making policy on the run there, but I think it's sort of within what we've been thinking about.
Thanks, Cliff. Sadie, I want to turn to you now, and your session yesterday about success for Indigenous students, and also, I suppose, broadening it out from there. There's been a recurrent theme over the past couple of days of regionality and diversity, and questions about is there diversity, the challenge that Glyn Davis raised, but regionality, regional universities, regional higher education providers, and the needs of different kinds of students, whether that be funding needs or support or other factors like that. So, what are your reflections so far on what you've heard?
Well, firstly, I think that the amount of goodwill is just quite amazing. I've talked to several people after sessions as well about the need to improve curriculum or wanting to introduce how they talk to their Indigenous students, and I think that that's actually really quite amazing. And as Sophie said, it's so fantastic to the more. As at the conferences every year, there's more and more student voice, and there's more appreciation of the fact that we are in universities for students. But I actually think it's really important when we're looking at talking to students, whether they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, whether they're regional students, that we look at a cross-section of students. And why I say that is I think that when we contact a university, they'll give us 1 or 2 students that they really think you should talk to, yeah? And that's fantastic, because they're probably the ones that really stand out, but they only have a reflection on the matters that they understand. If we talk to a student organisation, they're one of the best places to talk to on a university, because they really represent their constituents, their students. However, there are only certain opinions as well. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, oh, this is terrible of me, but I was thinking of my 20-year-old self. And 20-year-old Sadie was very bossy and used to go with her friends to the student advisors, to the curriculum advisors, that tell you this is how you should have your degree. And I'd say, actually, they don't need to do that. They could do it this way, and it would better suit them as an individual, which is very, very cheeky. But the thing is that 20-year-old Sadie would tell you something different to 25-year-old Sadie, to how old Sadie is now. And I think that that's really important, is because we'd have a tendency to go, this is who we talk to understand regional students, or this is who we talk to understand Indigenous students. And it's really important to actually go to the ground and talk to the 18-year-olds that are in the hallway, and talk to the students that are on your student associations, and talk to those students that have made it to a national level, so that we really understand the different experiences, because I can only tell you what's going on with a student who's 18 because I teach those students, not because I am one of those students. And I think that that's really important, is that they need to have their voice like I need to have mine. And I think that way we can really understand the issues that are going on within certain sections of student life and within certain regional institutions and metropolitan institutions.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Sadie. I'm going to turn to you again in a moment, Kwong, although you've just been reflecting, so I don't wish to make you reflect again, but if there's any comment you'd like to add. But just before I say that, in a moment we'll go into the Q&A. They will be arriving on the screen, as they have done throughout the conference, but we also thought for this final session of today that we ought to offer those of you in the hall here who wish to raise a question. There are microphones. There's one at the centre towards the back, and there's one here at the front. We can't do roving mics because the auditorium is just too big. But we do have microphones. They're ready to receive. And what I will do is, if anyone would like to ask a question from the floor, then just come up to the microphone. And what I'll do is I'll weave in any questions here with questions from you here in the hall, live, speaking live. So voices are heard as well. So the microphones are there and ready. But Kwong, anything you want to add to the points you've made so far, or in response to what you've just heard?
There's one issue that has kept coming up, Anthony, with a few people that I've talked to concerned with the real bread and butter of the accreditation, reaccreditation processes. And that is that people are very understanding of the resource constraints that TEQSA has. But that said, there's still that sort of feeling of letdown when, through no fault of your own, staff leave and the very people have been interacting with in terms of the development of their documentation and the focus that they should be having. And they suddenly find that the person's gone. Mm. Now, if there's any way of at least giving, maybe through senior people in the institution, some kind of pre-warning that there's a problem surfacing, just so that they don't suddenly feel let down. I know it's difficult, and I know that there is a genuine empathy and understanding with the problems that you're facing, but it just has that effect, and it's probably worth actually raising it publicly.
Yeah, I can't really direct that one to Cliff. I think that's fairly and squarely in my territory. And look, it's a really good point. We know that we know how much providers value the continuity of a case manager relationship with TEQSA staff, and we have done our best to sustain that. It has been difficult in recent times with turnover of staff and with some of the constraints on resources. We're asking ourselves at the moment, are there ways in which we can maintain the continuity of relationship and the continuity of knowledge, but perhaps within a team basis, rather than simply placing everything on a particular individual who, when they move on for whatever reason, then there's that sense of discontinuity. So look, we are hearing this. It was loud and clear. There was reference earlier on, actually, in the session from the Higher Education Standards Panel to the TEQSA survey, which we did for the second time this year. And again, that message about the value that providers place on that relationship was very loud and clear. So I think you're right to raise it, and it's something that we are giving very active consideration to. We're not sure we can maintain it in exactly the way it's been done in the past, but we need to maintain that essential kind of continuity of relationship. Just to show that we're not shying away from controversy, I'm going to read out one of the questions. Good to see a student expert advisory panel group. What about a student commissioner? Cliff?
I can see that it's a very good idea. The Office for Students in the UK is going to have a student on the board, as I understand it. But that's a question for the Minister, really, and being a TEQSA Commissioner, I couldn't possibly comment on that.
Would Sadie or Sophie like to make a comment on that?
I mean, I think absolutely there should be a student commissioner. I'm all for it.
I would definitely agree on that.
I thought you might. There's another interesting comment here, which I think is a statement rather than a question. A colleague has said, this may be a minority view, but let's recognise that when you're visiting an institution, your host doesn't tend to show you the skeletons in the cupboards. Let's keep a focus on the data and by all means adapt which metrics you're evaluating in consultation with the sector. So, not, I think, excluding that importance of direct contact, but just putting a question mark and saying, look, the metrics approach, which I think TEQSA was actually quite pioneering in developing among quality assurance agencies, is a very important part of the mix.
I don't think that there would be any sense in which the visits would be a substitute for the data. I mean, basically, they're complementary to data gathering. And when we say data, we don't just mean the numbers as in our risk assessments. I mean, we mean all of the other information and intelligence that we obtain from providers. I must say one thing that when Marnie was talking this morning about some of the things that they do at ANU, it came up, the idea of being open and being honest and, you know, admitting mistakes are made and so on came up. And it corresponds to something I've been thinking about that my colleagues want might want to walk away from a million miles, but it seems to me that one of the things that we should be doing is possibly saying to providers, you know, even maybe, you know, we want you every couple of years to send in a certificate to us that you've been compliant, or that you've had some problems and this is the way that you've dealt with them. I just, you know, I think, again, it would require an environment in which there's a high degree of kind of trust here, mutual trust, but I don't think that that's completely lacking, and I think it might be worth exploring a bit more how we can get some of that more, you know, just really more open and honest conversations, which I'm not saying people are dishonest with us, but I'm saying I think that, I mean, we know there must be more that's been happening out there, and we'd actually like examples of how well people have dealt with problems as overrides, as crystallised and so on. Well, as I say, that's a off the top of my head thought.
Examples of how people have done things well, I think, is an interesting one. And it leads into the next question that we've got here on the screen, which is, with TEQSA's focus on engaging student representatives to get their inputs, is TEQSA looking forward to sharing such useful information with all providers to ensure continuous improvements on quality and student experience? If so, in what form? And I might just turn that around for a moment and ask Sadie and Sophie to comment on what might be useful in terms of TEQSA's dissemination of good practice, insights from places where student engagement, and we've had some examples in this conference, seems to be working well and effectively.
Did you want
I mean, the relationship between TEQSA, I think the reason that it's worked so well at this conference is from the get-go, it wasn't just, you know, let's invite a few students along. They involved us in the entire process, in what sessions were included in the schedule, what the schedule actually looked like, what student speakers, you know, were on the panels. So from the very, very beginning, there were students involved in the process, and I think that talks to a trust and respect between TEQSA and students, and I think that universities and institutions can learn a lot from that to actually, you know, ensure that students aren't just there at the end. They aren't just, you know, oh, you know, better get some students on the panel, you know, better tick that box. It was the very beginning, and I think that, you know, we should be doing that with our course construction. We should be doing that with our, you know, academic boards when we're developing what we want the student experience to look like over the next, you know, 10 years. We should have students from the beginning involved in that process, and I think that that's something that TEQSA did really well in developing this conference.
Yeah, I would actually really agree on that. I think that, being honest here, I think that we have a tendency to, there are some institutions that do it really well and there are some institutions that don't do it so well, and it doesn't actually matter what that, what it is. And I think that if we have a recommendation, like the Indigenous strategies from Universities Australia, for example, if we actually have something that says, you know what, we actually think that this is a really good standard for curriculum, then the universities have a benchmark, or higher education institutions have a benchmark to go, okay, this is what we need to have. And I think that that's a really important thing, because we've got really goodwill right now, and that's absolutely fantastic, but we also need to write that goodwill down, and we also need to write that best practice down so that we're still adhering to that in a couple of years when we might have different management that might not feel the same way. Thanks.
And it's worth just adding to that TEQSA recently published a good practice guide to academic integrity. It was authored by Tracy Brettag at the University of South Australia. And I think I'm correct in saying for the first time, TEQSA, in one of its publications, included named examples of good practice at particular providers. And the response to that good practice guide has been very positive. We followed it up with a forum which discussed some of the issues that were raised by the guide and some of the ways in which providers were responding to issues of academic integrity. And we certainly envisage doing more good practice guides like that. Actually, it's very easy, particularly with a compliance-based framework, to look only at the negatives, to think, where's the risk, where are the problems? And of course, in the course of what we do, we see a great many examples of good practice and things that are positive. And I think we're very keen to play more of a role in response to requests from providers in disseminating that. So I think we'll be following up on that approach. There's a technical question, well, sort of technical question about the way that TEQSA's risk assessments use data which is coming from 2015. What's TEQSA's position to bridge this gap to ensure timely and relevant feedback? Cliff, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. One is, if you would like us to use real-time data, we can. The burden on you would be tremendous. We would need you to be providing us with returns on your staffing and your attrition rates and so on at the end of every year. That isn't to sort of duck the issue completely. There are moves afoot, learning from something that's been happening in the UK for the departmental information to be processed more quickly than in the past. Quite often, a lot of it is gathered and is taking a heck of a long time to be managed into shape and made available even to us for access. I gather there's quite a bit of effort now going into that. If you have any bright ideas about more contemporaneous sources of information we could use, please let us know. It's something we've been thinking about a lot ourselves, and in particular, what are the lead indicators? Now, when we have attrition and completions and so on in our risk assessments, the reality is if you've got high attrition, a harm has happened, a risk has crystallised. What we really want to be able to do is to pick up indicators that will say to us, oh, a year or two down the track, you really need to be looking at this provider because we're seeing those things. So, again, if anybody has creative ideas about lead indicators that we can use, we'd value them greatly.
I want to use that as a link into another question we've had, which goes back to the presentation that Nick Saunders gave at the beginning of the conference. And I think I'm going to direct this one to Kwong, not to you, Cliff, because it'd be interesting to see how Kwong responds to it. The question is that Nick Saunders spoke about TEQSA's role possibly changing from assessment to one of monitoring. Can you elaborate on that change? And I think both Cliff and I could, but it would be interesting to see. I think what Nick was indicating was the tension many regulators feel between the cyclical work, the regular, in our case, usually 7 years re-registration, and the need to monitor. And actually, what's the balance between those two activities? And for TEQSA, could or should it change in the future?
I actually see this from the side of institutions in two ways. I'm on the council of one of the Australian universities that is being re-registered in the next 12 months. I'm on the academic board of a provider that comes from a vet base but has now a number of higher education courses accredited and is looking to build on that and go further with self-accreditation over time and things of that sort. So I see this from the point of view of the institutions and the genuine, willing staff who want to do the very best they can to present themselves well to reassure their own community and TEQSA that they're actually doing what they should be doing. And I read Nick Saunders' comment there as saying, after going through a patterning where over a number of years there's a high success rate for some institutions in their interactions with you, re-accrediting, re-registering, as saying, I wonder whether we're actually making the best use of both our time and resources and the institution's time and resources. If the outcome is going to be tick, you're doing well, keep going, see you 7 years, are there better ways of spending resources on both sides to actually do something a bit more positive? Now, I don't think that I've got any answers directly there, but a bit of, as it were, without prejudice, informal discussion from both sides on an issue like that could be quite valuable, I think, because what it does is it says, look, we're secure enough about the short, medium term. We want to look out a bit and make sure that we are doing the best we can and not just pushing people through a whole lot of formulaic things on both sides.
Sure. Thank you for that, Kwong. Now, I see that someone has gone for the microphone challenge. And
Is it on?
it should be on, and if you just say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Sadie from the University of Technology, Sydney. I can't let this opportunity go without saying, first of all, to Anthony and to the organisers of the conference and the students, how fantastic and affirming it's been to have such a strong student voice at the conference. I'm thinking about going forward and sustainability, and as Anthony knows, we're planning a Student Voice, Student Leaders Summit in the new year with the students and working with TEQSA. My question, I suppose, is does TEQSA have any other plans for moving forward to facilitate student voice in universities and across the sector, as well as the student advisory, expert advisory group, which is fantastic?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. And I think that the Student Advisory Board, Expert Advisory Board, for us is an important starting point, and it's an important point also in scoping a wider agenda of the other kinds of things that might be done. This conference, of course, is another example of that, and this relates in part to some of the questions which have come in. In fact, I'm just going to read one out, which I think is relevant. Is TEQSA prepared to embrace student partnership and expected at institutions that want to meet the student participation in governance components of the higher education standards? So I think TEQSA is conscious of a couple of things in that space. The first being that TEQSA's framework is the higher education standards framework, of course, and in guiding providers as to what we're going to expect there, you will have seen on our website a regular cycle of guidance notes, which we, again, regularly update in response to feedback. We are careful in those guidance notes to distinguish, as far as we can, between those matters which are of regulatory expectation and those matters which are, if you like, matters of good practice, matters where there could be different ways of answering the same question. And we think that's very much in the spirit of the way that the new standards have been drafted, which are more detailed in many ways about expectations, but less detailed about how you get there. Now that then comes back to the important principle of diversity, that we don't think it's TEQSA's role to dictate how providers meet the expectations in the standards. The expectations are clear, but we recognise that there is a legitimate diversity of ways in which providers can achieve those standards. That may not go all the way to answering some of the issues around homogeneity that were raised by by Glyn Davis, but I think it's an important aspect of the way that we approach our task. I don't know, Cliff, if you want to add to that.
No, that's fine.
That's, okay, I see another person at the microphone.
Hello, Ian Lang from University of Melbourne and also the AFTRS. This is really about what Glyn Davis was saying in Australia having one comprehensive university with 220 campuses.
Yeah.
As TEQSA goes on, say, towards the next sort of couple of years, do you think you would get enough data to be able to advise government where the university sector may be able to diversify itself a bit better? One of the conversations I've had here would be, the United States has diversified itself by creating university systems. In the State University of New York system, the Californian system. Is that one possible way forward? Because it would need the kind of data that you're aggregating.
I'm conscious of time. I'm conscious that those are deep policy waters, and policy will ultimately be a matter for government and the department. We heard earlier on that there is going to be an important, or there's very likely to be an important strand of work around the provider categories, and TEQSA certainly has some insights from the totality of the work that it's done over 6 years around the way in which the provider categories are working, and we would be contributing to those perspectives. I want to finish now by, appropriately I think, by a question which is for the students. And it's a question that says, that asks this. Students often feel that their voice is too small in a large bureaucratic environment, even the voice of student leadership. How do we rally students together to provide more quantitative feedback to higher education institutions so that we will be better heard? We have two student leaders on the panel. Sophie, do you want to have a first try at that?
Yeah, I don't really think that we can tackle that issue until we do have an environment where students and student leaders really are a partner in the decision making and in the processes of the university. One thing that universities can do right away is actually making sure that they're providing the kind of training and support to student leaders as soon as they get into their roles, so that straight away they don't have to wait a few months once they're comfortable and have learned the whole bureaucracy of the universities, so that they have that training provided to them right away, so that they can do as much as they can in those first few months. But really, I think that it's going to take both students actively trying to engage in those kind of decisions, but also the university actively bringing the students in and ensuring it's there from the beginning, like I've said a million times.
Thanks, Sophie. Sadie, you get the last word.
Oh, lovely. I always love the last word. I think that it's such an important thing to do, and as we all know, it is incredibly hard sometimes. And for Indigenous students in particular, our associations and our university don't actually necessarily get the contact details because of how universities work. So the only people who can contact Indigenous students are the centres, or are the specific people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers that are there being able to contact the Indigenous students. So I think actually creating connections with those institutions really gains that voice of that particular cohort of student. I also think that running sessions like Sally's, so I've been to a few of Sally's student voices sessions around the country, and I think that you get a momentum, you get an emphasis on the fact that these students, their opinion is super appreciated for you. And on a day-to-day basis, students, as this question says, don't necessarily feel that. And so I think if you get a momentum on campus and you go, actually, we want to hear from you and we want to hear from you on a really regular basis, I think that you'll end up getting students who've got a whole lot of pride in their institution and have that self-confidence and self-efficacy to have their own opinion within that institution.
Thanks very much, Sadie. We've still got a screen full of questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but none of them are lost. They're all recorded, and we will try to get answers to all the questions that have been submitted.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Big round of applause.